This is Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
The difference an article makes. This is Wretched Radio. You've got yourself a definite article like the. You've also got yourself indefinite articles like a. Christianity has both. The question is, when do we use a definite and when do we use an indefinite article? The difference might mean whether or not you have any Christian friends or not, or whether your church splits or not, or whether you find yourself on an island with maybe one or two other individuals who think exactly the way you do on every single issue. Not very likely. That is why you and I need to know the difference between a and the. Romans 14 appears to be a peculiar chapter in the great theological treatise by Paul, which demonstrates, again, the supernatural nature of the Bible by being so brilliant. Don't know if you've noticed, but if you ever meet somebody, especially in the Middle East, but even in the West, who practices the religion of peace, it appears they're stuck in a century, specifically women's clothing. Why? Because the Quran does not contain Romans 14. Romans 14 is the chapter on what we would call adiaphora. These are areas where Christians can have a difference of opinion. And it is God's brilliant way of allowing human beings to work through complex issues without going to war, without judging one another, so that we can have unity. And you might be saying, wait a second, you can't have unity without truth. I totally agree. But what Romans 14 tells us, brace yourself for this, and please don't think suddenly I've become a member of the Democratic Party, I've become a liberal theologian. No, but there are times when certain issues are a truth and not the truth. Did you hear the tires screeching out of the tens and tens of people listening to this here Wretched Radio program? What do you mean? There can be a truth. Is that postmodernism? No, that's Romans 14. And I would like to suggest to you, if we can carefully work our way through this chapter in the Bible, you and I might find ourselves having more joy and more unity with more brothers and sisters, especially in an era where I see increasingly we are becoming divided. There are two subjects in particular that are currently raging in Christendom that are causing a great deal of divides. And let's start with COVID. That's right, the old COVID conundrum. There are Christians with differences of opinion. Some are opening up their churches. Some are adhering to the government mandates, whatever they happen to be, a percentage, the distance between people, wearing the masks. Different churches are reacting differently to the same set of information that we all have access to. And I've noticed we're starting to cop a bit of an attitude toward those churches that don't do it exactly the way that we do. Or some of us are leaving our good churches because we don't agree with what the elders have decided is the right way to approach this situation. Might I suggest to you, COVID, maybe there's an aspect of it where this doesn't apply, but COVID is an truth issue. That different churches are going to see the situation based on their history, their people, maybe even, for all I know, their comorbidities, what their government is mandating, where they're at in the history of the church. And they're making decisions that some perhaps don't agree with. And I would suggest to you that if they are working through the subject, whatever it is that they decide about whether or not they should open up, whether or not they should tell the government, sorry, we have to obey God, wherever your church is at on that spectrum, I would suggest to you that is a truth. But it's not the truth. One small caveat, if your church is obeying government ahead of God, that would be a sin. But if your church is striving through prayer, maybe through fasting, to be wise, to do the best thing that is the most in obedience with God's word in a situation that has a ton of moving parts, then what your church decides is a truth. And my church, if we decide something different, that is a truth too. And I can't judge your church because you are following a truth. Because the Bible gives us permission for these things. Don't we see the world at war over masks and vaccinations? This ought not to be for the Christian community. We ought to recognize there are biblically permissible situations where a truth is valid. And I would suggest to you this is one of those times. Now, here's where it always gets a bit tricky, doesn't it? But you're convinced, you're fully persuaded in your mind, this is the way that it should go. I get that. And nevertheless, I know that we must wrestle with Romans 14. We do not have in any of the great theological statements that I am aware of a line that includes, if your church doesn't react like this to COVID, you're apostate. We don't have that. Why? Because theology applies to this situation, but this is not a theological issue per se. In other words, different Christians are going to have different takes on it. And we need to recognize that is okay and not just perhaps not be snarky towards somebody who masks or doesn't mask, but to actually love them, recognizing it's okay. I don't have to be as agitated as Fox News wants me to be. I do not have to be as mad as most conservative talk radio programs would desire for you to just, rah! How many blogs? We got to do something. That's enough. We can't put up with this anymore. That's not the Christian heart toward our brothers and sisters who have a truth about COVID. Up in Canada, in Edmonton, Grace Life Church has decided they are going to defy the government and continue to worship. Even if in secret, they're going to do it. And there are some Christians that are applauding and others are jeering them for that. That's not the correct response, frankly, from either of us. More so, especially those who would be jeering them. They're doing what they think is best. Do I agree with them? And the answer in one sense is yes. In the other sense, it's I have no idea because I'm not there. I'm not in that context, and I wouldn't know what decision I'd make because I'm not a part of their church, in their place, at this time, in that country, with their people. But I would say if that's what they've chosen to do, then good on them. Does that mean everybody has to do that? No. And to the church maybe right down the street that says we're actually going to do exactly what we're told to do. Their motives are right. They're seeking the Lord. They're studying the Bible. They're trying to be stewards of what God has put them in charge of. They are trying to be godly shepherds. And what they decide then is right for them. That's not postmodernism. That's Romans 14. And so do I agree with what Grace Life Church is doing? Sure. If your church is doing the opposite, I think what you're doing is right too. Because we let other believers go about the business of making decisions on subjects that are not theologically crystal clear issues and ultimately have a different conclusion. And this is the tough part about this. They're both right. They're both right. There are sometimes, in some situations, multiple truths. In other words, multiple Christian responses to the same set of data. And my heart is inclined to determine that anybody who doesn't render the same verdict that I have come up with, well, they're clearly wrong. And I need to back up and, frankly, grow up. Read Romans 14 and recognize, no, they've simply come up with a different decision, and I love them. And here's how I know that Romans 14 is correct in this particular situation. Because I am convinced that should you and I ever find ourselves in a jail cell, and my church decided this, your church decided that, my family did this with COVID, your family did that, I don't think it's going to keep us from singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to the Lord as we're shackled together at the ankle. Why? Because of Romans 14. And if you and I want to divide the church further, we're going to stick to our guns on issues that do not require it. But the Bible gives permission for different believers to come with different conclusions, and we can love one another as we go through it and say to them, well done. Hey, not the decision I made, but well done, because that is a Christian truth. This is Wretched Radio.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is